But there are some very serious issues that can happen as we age if our brain shrinks. And that's what happens when you lose neural integrity. When your brain, when those neurons, those synapses aren't connecting and talking clearly, they wither. It's just like a muscle. If you don't use a muscle, it gets smaller, right? That's called atrophy. And what happens in your brain is literally an atrophy, and you get a loss of neural integrity. And the more that happens, the less connection you have and the less firing that you have. So your brain is trying to scramble around to move, memories over here and get it to function for you. That's why exercise is very incredibly important to you. And guess what? One of the best things you can do for neural integrity is exercise every day, physical activity every day. And I'll explain why neuroscientists think that this is how our bodies work, and they've proved it. And that regular activity actually creates new brain cells. You've heard that learning something new, like doing Sudoku or something, that will fortify or give you more brain cells. Good for your brain. It is good for your brain because you're engaging it and you're making it work. But do you know that the effect is 5,000 times more powerful if you exercise in combination with doing this? And I'll explain why that is. And that process, it's a new term. It's called neurogenesis. Genesis, the beginning, neural genesis, new neurons. That's all it is. Real simple stuff. So, and you can ask questions. If you have a question, raise your hand, because I think this is more fun when you're curious about something and you want to ask a question. Yeah, go ahead.
I listen to books on tape a lot more than I read. When I sit down and read, I tend to get sleepy.
Yes.
Is that
It does to a degree, but it's more of a passive. You're receiving information passively. Like TV. Did you know that the brain waves, they do something called electroencephalographs, which is the little hairnet. You've probably seen it on TV at some point. Little hairnet they put on you, and it measures the electrical impulses of your brain. And when you take information in passively like you do with television, and books on tape, not quite the same, but very similar, your brain has the same waves as someone that's in a coma. It's very similar. It's not exact, but it's very similar because it's passive. It's passive receiving of information. Just like our program. I'm sorry. No, actually, this is more engaging. This is a little more engaging when you're listening to a lecture because your brains are thinking right now. I can see it. You're all going, how does this apply to me? How is this going to affect my life? That's a little different lecture-wise because you're wanting to keep this information. Often if we're watching a sitcom, do you really want to remember every dialogue and everything that happened? Not really. Now, it's more engaging if you're watching like the Discovery Channel and you're wanting to remember some information there. That's a little more engaging because you're part of that process. You're engaged. Just like our program, right? You're not going to get healthy and fit without being engaged. Well, it's the same premise. See that whole concept? It's holistic. There's a lot of truth that's just universal. It works for everything, right? Makes sense. So I'm going to share some things, some scientific stuff. And again, you don't have to remember this. It's not super important, the details. Some of you may be spiked and interested, and I can give you information if you want to read more. In fact, I'm going to recommend one book that's exceptionally good, and it's fun to read, and it's really meant for everybody, not for scientists necessarily, and you'll enjoy it. But one of the things I want to share is that your brain, like again, it's hormones, neurochemicals, and mechanisms. This is how we think, how we feel. That's how it happens, serotonin, norepinephrine, all these funny things, and I'll talk about it. But there's this new chemical that's been discovered, and it's only really been about maybe 12 years that scientists have been identifying, maybe almost 15 years that they've been identifying this new chemical. And it's not new, it's just been identified. That's it. It's in there. There are a lot of things like that. Like food. You guys heard me talk about food. A couple of people that I'm coaching, that there's a synergy in food that you'll never duplicate how an apple reacts inside your body with a pill. Can't happen. Well, our bodies are like that. We may identify a lot of stuff. We'll never figure it all out because it's so complex and so interesting. But the basic thing is that there's this chemical inside our brain. It's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. You can remember it as miracle grow for the brain. That's what neurologists call it. It's a chemical inside your brain that helps your brain cells stay fat and plump. It's a very, very important chemical. In fact, when they first discovered it, they were doing that little trick where they were slicing brain cells, and they were doing it in mice first, and then they did it in humans, and they were able to take this BDNF, derive it out, put it in a little tincture, and drop it into a brain cell on a little petri dish. And the brain cell was still alive, and what they found was when you drip that BDNF on there, and this is a very crude thing, over time, over a short period of time, that cell actually got fat. It got bigger, got plumper, so its integrity got bigger. And the other thing that happened is it got more of those little fingers, dendrites, more opportunities to connect to other neurons. Pretty cool, huh? Right. And guess what? When you exercise, you release huge amounts of BDNF. Huge amounts. Guess what happens when you don't exercise? Those levels are pretty low. They're pretty low. Why? Because our bodies actually function better when we're active. They do. Across the board, they function better. And you know why they think that is? Think back a few hundred years. How did we live? We actually were more hunter-gatherers. We had to go find food. We had to remember where the water was. We had to remember how to survive. We had to pass information along. A lot of our history was oral, right? And there was a connection between us migrating, moving, physically active, and memory. So that mechanism makes perfect sense that our brains function much better and memory functions much better when we're physically active. Doesn't that make sense? Now, we spend, a lot of time doing this and this. That's why we have to take time outside of our regular schedules to do, specific type exercise to stay active. But this supplements what you do. It's a very powerful mechanism. I'm going to share a lot more things like that. Here's another little thing, another little tidbit. And again, you don't have to remember what it is, what it does, just how it works. There are two what we call growth factors. There's something called insulin-like growth factor and vascular endothelial growth factor, right? And these growth factors are released into the bloodstream, and they travel around your whole body, and they actually go right to your brain. And guess where these factors are released? In the muscle. They're released inside your muscles when they contract, when they're working. And that's the only time that they're released in any significant amount. So when you're actually physically active, you're releasing these hormones, and they're like hormones, they're growth factors, and these things go out throughout your body, and they found it goes directly into your brain, and it's directly associated with higher thinking processes because it lights up the front of your brain. This is remember this maybe from high school, prefrontal cortex. It's the front of your brain. This is where we have executive control is what it's called. It's how we make good decisions. It's how we stop ourselves from putting our foot in our mouth sometimes. Or that when we make a mistake, we learn from the mistake and actually don't repeat that mistake and we actually learn. Kids with ADD, ADHD, usually have very low activity in the prefrontal cortex. I'm going to talk to you about how physical activity is very critical to the learning process for kids. It's very important. I'll talk about it. But guess what? Same thing for adults. Children are slightly different because other things are going on, but essentially we all function the same, regardless of age. So what does that mean? It means physical activity fortifies how we learn and how we think. Pretty impressive, I think. It's powerful for me. Then there's this other thing, a term, it's called long-term potentiation. Okay? Long-term potentiation is a term that's used by neurologists and neuroscientists because it's a very important term. It means that those neurons, what we showed you, the little cells that I showed you, that they do a really good job of communicating. And how do we learn things sometimes is through repetition. Repetition fires neural pathways, and that's how we get memory. And we enhance the learning process by that repetition, and we get a lot of long-term potentiation. But guess what? BDNF and these growth factors make that process happen much better. It actually helps long-term potentiation. It prepares the brain chemically to actually do that function, to make it work. So these things working together literally make your brain work better, make it bigger, increase what we call the integrity, and it works faster. It actually fires faster. You think quicker. You're much clearer. Have you felt that so far with exercise? Sometimes some of you may exercise in the morning. When you get to work, are you feeling pretty fired up? That's not a placebo. That's real. Something's happening chemically inside your body that makes it happen. It's part blood flow and oxygen, but it's also these chemicals that are happening. It's a much more complicated process, isn't it? But all you have to remember is that it's good. It makes everything work better.